Welcome everyone to the Android Developer Lab. This is the first episode of the Android Developer Lab Plus, and we're really excited to be launching it. So this is a revamp of what we used to have called Office Hours, and it just basically expands on that show. So let me start off by introducing the team.
I'll go first, yeah. Hi guys, I'm Anirudh Devani and I'm based out of Hyderabad office in India.
I'm Tony Chen and I am based out of Hong Kong.
And I'm Anka Cotwell and I'm based out of Sydney, Australia. So we're really glad to have everyone joining us today. We are just getting the show started, so just give us a few minutes. We are just making sure that people online are able to join our link, and as soon as we've got that up, we should be right to go. So in the meanwhile, Tony, do you want to give us an update on some of the questions that we had last week to do with low-level media?
Yes, sure. So let me pull the question up. So basically, there are two questions we left an answer last week, and so we try to find an answer, and here you go. So the first one is, can the leap stage flight classes be used in the JNI code somehow? JNI versus Android Source Tree incompatibility and stable native interface. So so basically, the answer is yeah, why not? And you can certainly do that, but one thing you need to pay attention is for if you are using the native interface, there's no guarantee those interface will not change. So when you go for that approach, make sure you pay attention to our source tree changes and make sure it's not broken. So that's the caveat. So another question we left an answer last week was, is there any supported way to stream live video and audio? So I think last week we forgot to mention something. We do have HTTP live stream support in Honeycomb and Plus devices. So also prior to a Honeycomb, there are some probably commercial solutions as well for live streaming, and we have seen developers written their own solution before on our end before, so it's pretty doable. So I guess that's pretty much addressed like some of them unanswered question last week.
Thanks, Tony. So what we're going to do today is a little bit different. As I mentioned, the format is changing. So let's get started. We're going to flick over to our presentation right now. And here we go. So firstly, we just start off with some news. These are just basically some of the events that have happened in terms of the Android developer world over the last week. The first one is that we've launched Preview 2 of the Android Developer Tools version 21. So this is the upcoming version. Don't be too concerned if if you're able to get the URL down or not. We'll go and edit the YouTube video and put it in there. But certainly you can do a Google search for this. The next one is that one of our team members has released some sample code actually for some scrolling tricks. So let me just bring that up. So the ADT preview is up. Tor Norbai is one of the engineers that works on the SDK tools, and he's announced the availability of these tools on his Plus page. Roman Nurick and Nick Butcher, who are also Android developer advocates, put together this great little sample app. There's some code there, and you can just see what it basically looks like. You'll notice that there are some scrolling tricks that we've been implementing with our apps So as they scroll down here, you'll notice that the little white bar disappears, but as soon as they pull down, the white bar shows up again. So it's kind of like a floating or docked bar across the top, but there's a sticky version of it as well. So it's some really nice source code there, so you can see if it's worth implementing or something that you consider to be useful for your apps. We use it in the Google Play client, actually. Another one is that is what we call the pin or progress. So it's something that we sort of introduced in the Google Movies client, and you'll notice that as well as books actually. So as you're downloading content, you get this little pin, which is what you toggle to say whether to download or not, and the progress bar starts to fill up. So Roman again put together some great sample code, and you can go and grab it from the URL that's just displayed here as well. It's just a shortened version, or you can just follow Roman on Google+. So with that being said, that's pretty much the biggest things that have happened from our side of the Android developer ecosystem. I know there's been plenty of things in the community side. The other thing we're going to do today that's a bit different is that we're going to have a message from our sponsor, and our sponsor this week is the AndroidManifest file. So we thought we'd share some pro tips with you guys, because there has been some confusion in the past and ways to really optimize your development. So we thought we'd share those with you. We're going to start off by talking about Users SDK. So Users SDK is a tag that you'd have in your manifest file, and there's a couple of attributes on there that are quite important, and they can really make some dramatic impacts to your app's compatibility and availability on Google Play. So let's get started. The first one is the minimum SDK version, or we state it as min SDK version. So what it is it basically tells the device that, hey, this app needs a minimum version of this API level to be able to run. Now, when you specify the minimum SDK version in your manifest file, it is up to you as the developer to ensure that you're not calling APIs that are not supported in that SDK version. Or, if you are, you're putting version gates around them, so you're checking that that particular API is available on that version of the platform. Now, the good thing is that once you start using the SDK version, if you're using more recent versions of the Android developer tools, we added lint support. So lint is a compile time check that goes and sees if you're doing anything anything not quite right with your source code. So this is an example where what it'll do is it'll actually check what the minimum SDK version that has been specified in your manifest is, and to see whether you're calling any particular APIs that are not supported in that minimum SDK version. So it's a really nice handy tool, and those warnings should definitely be actioned. The thing about the minimum SDK version is that when a user goes to install an APK, so let's say you're sideloading an app, the operating system will actually check whether it is a version that's higher than greater than or equal to the minimum SDK version. So the operating system itself will confirm that. Google Play also does this. So if you're running on, let's say, a Gingerbread device and a minimum SDK has been set to Honeycomb, if you search for that app on Google Play, on your Gingerbread device, Play won't actually show that app. Actually, if you go to the web version of Google Play and you sign in, you search for that particular app, you'll notice that when you try to install the app through the web version, there's a way you can choose which device you want to install to. It won't actually present devices that are below that minimum SDK version. So by default, the value that's there, it's an implicit value that defaults to 1, which means it supports every version of Android. But we always, in terms of best practices, we recommend that you explicitly specify the minimum SDK version. And it's also a way for you to make sure that you're targeting the right set of users. If you have a very media-heavy app, for example, or an app that requires a certain level of a device, minimum SDK is one way to do it, one way to check to ensure that it doesn't get installed on the wrong device. So please, go and explicitly specify minimum SDK. Now you might be looking at that and saying, well, it's not there by default, so why do I need it? Well, the next bit of useful information is the target SDK. The target SDK is basically saying to, well, you're saying by specifying a target SDK that this particular app is guaranteed to run on a particular API level. And the reason that you should be stating it is that it actually enables a whole bunch of features in the background. So what we recommend, and we're going to talk about what some of those features are, what we recommend in terms of our best practices is that you should always set your target SDK version in your app to be the latest version of Android. Okay? Just because you set it to, let's say, 15, API level 15, if you try to install it on, let's say, a Gingerbread device, which is API level 9, it's not going to actually prevent it from running. What it will do is that it'll default back to the API level 9 behavior on those API level 9 devices. And this is where minimum SDK helps, because what you do is you use the minimum SDK to specify what's the lowest version or oldest version of Android that you can run, and you use target SDK to specify the one that you're really targeting. Now remember earlier I said that there will be some features that it enables. So let's talk about some of those. If you target API level 11 or greater, you actually get some nice benefits. It enables the holo theme, for example, in your app, so that all of your UI controls look modern, look up to date. They don't look like the Gingerbread versions. So for those apps that you've seen occasionally running on your ice cream sandwich devices that seem to have Gingerbread looking buttons, it's because they haven't specified a target SDK version of 11 or higher. So it's really important that you do go and enable it. So you get the holo theme. Then there's the screen compatibility mode, which is all about saying whether you want your app to stretch to fit or zoom to fit. And the more interesting one now is obviously the legacy menu button. So with our current generation of devices like the Galaxy Nexus, or in fact most of the Android tablets, they don't have a physical menu button. If you try to run a legacy app, an older app, with on these newer devices, what you'll find is that in your navigation bar, you get a little menu button. It looks like the overflow button, but it's the menu button. That's the legacy menu button, and it's something that really you should be moving away from and moving towards using the action bar. So target SDK version is what you use. As soon as you specify 11 or greater, it'll enable these things on the newer versions of the platform. If you target 14 or higher, you'll automatically get hardware acceleration, unless you explicitly mention that you don't want hardware acceleration in your app. But there are very few scenarios that we found where you wouldn't want that hardware acceleration. So really, try and follow these best practices of keeping the target SDK version up to the maximum version. Now you might be asking yourself, well, if this is how it works, why doesn't it implicitly target the newest version all the time? The reason is because there can be changes in behavior. So when we make certain changes in behavior to the Android framework, we make sure that we keep the existing behavior for if the app is targeting older API levels. So an example of changes in behavior is that we changed the async task threading model in API 13, where instead of having a pool of threads that execute async tasks, we use a single thread that runs async tasks serially, but still in a separate thread. So there can be minor changes in behavior, and so that's why we recommend that you do, not only do you update to the latest API level in your target SDK version, but you do go through your full test cycle. But as I said, the benefits are great.
Yeah, one thing I want to add is also like, for example, the action bar, when you enable set target SDK to greater than 11, so action bar will be something will be enabled like at that point. So if your app hasn't been tested on the later version, so make sure you test your app as well, because that will have an impact on the UI of your application.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. So the last one is the Max SDK version. And actually, as of Android 2.0.1, the operating system doesn't even look at the Max SDK version. It's only used in Google Play. So what happens is if you specify Max SDK version, it means that Google Play won't offer devices that are running newer versions of the newer version of the API, it won't offer your app, this particular app, to those devices. So you're kind of saying, hey, it'll only run up to Ice Cream Sandwich and not any further than that. And really, as an Android app developer, what you want to be doing is maximizing the number of people, well, maximizing the number of people that can install your app, right? So you don't want to be specifying these max SDK versions. Because remember what I said, when you're using target SDK version and you're fixing it to a particular value, we will ensure that you get the same behavior. So that async task change that I mentioned before, if your target SDK version isn't 13 or greater, you will get the older behavior. So in general, we don't actually recommend you use max SDK version. And the only real situation that I can come up with where you might want to use it is if you're using multi-APK support. So in Play, you're kind of saying, well, I've got different APKs targeting different versions of the platform. So an example of where you might want to do that is where you have an app today that's supporting a set of older Android versions, but in your next version of that app, you kind of want to say, I'm no longer supporting those old devices or old API versions, but I don't want to take that old version off the store for people that have old devices. So then what will happen, by using this, you would specify max SDK version for your older version of the app, and then people with older versions of the API, so you'd use a combination of max and min, obviously. People with the older versions of the platform will get the older app, so people on 1.5, 1.6. And then your newer users can get the latest updates and latest features. So it's really about making your life easier. But it is something that developers can overlook from time to time, and we really recommend that you certainly use minimum and target SDK versions.
Yeah, I think another thing I want to add is another use case I saw developer using the Max SDK version is when there is a major release, Android OS release, some developer may just temporarily set the Max SDK while they're doing extensive testing on the major release. I think that probably another real use case that may be useful for temporarily setting the Max SDK to the yeah.
Yep. All right, so that's users SDK. The next one we'd like to talk about is users feature. So, often you may have an app that you're using some sort of hardware feature, but it's not critical to the operation of your app. So an example of that is that you may have a brilliant app that does great photo editing. Now, one of the features of your app might be that you allow the user to take photos as well as edit existing photos in the gallery. Now, if you're taking photos, you might be wanting to use features like autofocus. So you don't want to get into a situation where people that have devices that don't have a specific hardware feature aren't able to use the core functionality of your app. So there are ways that you can actually specify that, hey, I would like to use this hardware feature if it's there, but if it's not, then go ahead anyway. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So in terms of how you would do this, you would typically say, hey, I want to use a camera, and then you can make decisions on which of those features are optional. So in the example here, we're saying we're using the camera, we're also using autofocus, but you'll notice at the bottom of that white text, it says Android required equals false. And that's stating that this particular autofocus feature is optional. Now, keep in mind that when you request these users features, for anything that is said to be required equals true, Google Play will filter on those. So at the top there, we said users feature camera, but we didn't actually specify required. It's implicit. It's implied there that required is true. That's the default value. So the second part, the autofocus, is actually saying it's optional. So you can make a decision as to which of these features are optional in your app, and then at runtime, what you do is that you can go through the package manager to go and find out if the system has that particular feature. So here we're checking if we have the feature at runtime. And then conditionally we are executing our code. So this is a nice way to kind of broaden the number of users and number of devices that your app can run on, whilst making sure that your app still hangs together. Now, I've provided a URL there at the bottom. We actually had a blog post about this. I'll just bring that up. We had a blog post about this all the way back in October, actually. Or October 2010, rather, I should add. So it's worth your while to have a look at this code and have a look through this blog post that kind of walks you through it in more detail. So let's go to the next section of the presentation. Users permission. So obviously, developers know that you can, at install time, you specify which Android permissions you'd like. Well, what we found is that there are a number of apps that request permissions that are over and above what they really require. And users are starting to really object to this. Android users are quite tech savvy, and they tend to know when an app is requesting more than they need to. Like a wallpaper app should never need to read through my contacts, for example. So what we wanted to do was present to you a list of what we consider to be the worst permissions that apps request. There are circumstances where you might need some of these permissions, but you really need to think long and hard. So the first one, well, we're going to start from 10 and go backwards. So changing Wi-Fi settings. There are very few instances where you should need to change a user's Wi-Fi settings. Doing things on boot. Again, it's one of those things that on boot you don't want a whole bunch of apps starting to do a lot of things. So keep that in mind. Start your app at the right time. Don't put an unnecessarily load on the app on the device by having your app start up at boot and stay resident continuously. You don't need to know what other tasks are running on a device in most situations. There are, again, very few scenarios where you would need to know this. Obtaining a fine location. Now, there are some apps that actually do need a very specific location, but often that you'll find the course location will be good enough, or the network location. You can also register for location updates that other apps request. So try and be smarter about retrieving this location. Getting fine location obviously also triggers the GPS, and the GPS in these mobile devices do consume a lot of power. So really challenge yourself or ask yourself, do you really need it? You should never need to read the system log. And it's something in Jelly Bean that's actually going away. You'll be able to read your own logs, but you won't have, this permission will pretty much not do anything from Jelly Bean onwards. You certainly won't be able to see the log of the rest of the system. So number 5, you should never need to directly call phone numbers. We actually have an intent that you can fire to say, hey, go fire up the dialer and pre-populate it with this phone number. The user still has to click dial, and that's the right way to do it. Rather than directly call a number yourself through your app, fire up the intent. The intent doesn't even require you to have a permission to do it. As I mentioned with things like wallpaper apps asking for reading contacts and calendar, people are very conscious about their privacy these days. So, again, ask yourself, do you really need that capability? The same goes with bookmarks. Displaying system-level alerts, spamming the notification bar, for example, and in general, system-level alert permissions. And number 1, and this is the worst one, is for apps to be sending and receiving SMSs. There are some premium services that may do this, but the majority of the apps that we see that are requesting these kind of permissions certainly don't need to do it. I'm not saying that they all have a malicious intent, but you should really be careful about this one, because you'll notice that many of the apps that request these sorts of permission get very negative feedback in the Play Store. And once it's there, you can't get rid of that negative feedback. So what should you do if you need some of these permissions? Firstly, describe the reason that you would need the permission on the Play Store. You have a great big section of description, and in there, you should state, hey, we need this permission because this is how we're using it. That's the responsible thing to do. Users love transparency, so the more transparent you are with them, the more they're going to trust you as well to do the right thing. you know, there can be ways of architecting your app such that you can separate that bit of functionality and make it optional through maybe a plugin or an add-on for your app that users can install separately, and then you can try triggering it through that mechanism. And finally, just put yourself in the shoes of the user. Would you be comfortable giving other apps the permissions that your app is requesting? If you truly believe that the answer is yes, then go ahead and do some of these things. But make sure, again, transparency, and you want to gain the trust of the user, and you certainly don't want to abuse it. Okay, so that concludes the sort of short presentation that we've had on the AndroidManifest Pro Tips. For now, what we're going to do is move to the Q&A section, and of course, this is going to be questions related to Android development. You know, we have the moderator questions. We also have some people that are here live with us. So let's open it up for questions. Let's see if the live audience has anything. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, just a quick one on the stuff you were talking about just a moment ago with permissions. Is it likely that, or an alternative, that you'd be able to have required kind of true or false on permissions in the same way that you can with features? So, you know, if I could have location, you know, find location as a permission, it's not actually required, and I could then test for that in my app to say, okay, these 5 features of my app can be used quite happily, but if I've been given permission to query the location, then this extra feature, you know, like pinpointing your location on a map, will then become usable. I mean, at the moment, a user has to accept all of the permissions in one file swoop rather than, you know, individually choosing which ones I've got access to, which I could then query later on.
Sure, that's a good question. And so let me start off by saying it's very hard for us to comment on what direction we are going, but let's just talk through some of that. Part of it is that we want to ensure that users have a really good experience when they install apps. They're not presented with, you know, a ton of questions that say, you know, here's 4 permissions that are requesting. Which ones do you want to turn on and off? So we really need to think about the user experience when it comes to installing apps. And then we also need to think about, well, what about developers that have already got an existing set of apps that are not stating that those permissions are optional? Should users be able to turn off permissions on an app? So what does it mean for our existing set of apps? What does it mean for the user experience if we were to do this? So there are a couple of things at play here. And so, as I said, I can't really comment on what's going to happen in the future. But, yeah.
I guess one of the current implementation developer currently is doing is to build some plugins, right? And in those plugins, asking for those optional permissions, right? I mean, if you have something that you think your apps can be optional, you can pull those features into a separate plugin. So and
when you say plugin, you mean a separate APK file that's going to be hosted on the Google Play Store?
Yeah, so it's a separate app, totally separate app. What you would do is you could go and check if you know that's installed, and if it's not installed, you could say, so when a user tries to use a feature, you could say, hey, you actually need to grab this piece of functionality from the Play Store, and you could direct them to the Play Store page, so they don't need to search for it or anything.
And policy-wise, that's okay, because it's really offering different functionality. It's not like you're putting like multiple same application on the Play Store, which is what we discourage.
Yeah, but for going back to Anka's point just a moment ago, I mean, all you've done there is kind of change the, hey, can I use your permission dialogue into a, hey, please go to the Google Play Store and download the map plugin for your application. You've not kind of made it as seamless. There's still a user interaction there.
Yeah, it is a delicate balance. There's no doubt about it. It's not a simple problem. We certainly admit that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So we've got a couple of other people on the Hangout. Any other questions from anyone before we move to moderator? Okay. So let's move to the moderator link. Let me just bring that up, and I will screen share. Actually, let's just do that window because then it'll be nice and large. There we are. So Tony, do you want to walk us through these, or Anirudh?
Yeah. Anyway, you want to take it, or I can?
I'm sorry, which question are we talking about?
Okay, I'll take this one. So, why do Android developer guides for parsing XML recommend using the XML pool parser when it appears the sex parsers are an order of magnitude faster? So, I think one reason we are recommending the pool parser, actually, sex parser in general is performance-wise compared to like Tom parser is really better, and in most cases, like the pool parser performance is actually better. But from the article you post there, the pool parser is the sex parser. There are two implementations. The sex one is really have a better performance, but again, it actually depends on the benchmark, and we can take this as a feedback and bring this back to the engineering team and see whether there's really a performance optimization that we can do on the pool parser. Also, in terms of coding style, I think the pool parser is better because you can select event you want to listen to. Versus like the sex parser, you have to. It's kind of like a push model instead of a pull model. So that's why I have. Anyway, have anything to add or Anchor?
Yeah, I mean, with the one difference is with pull parser, when you listen to the event types of start and end, you can only look at the events that you are interested in. But with the sax parser, you'll have to go through all the ones that come through the code that you write. So that's one benefit of using a pull parser.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is actually from Andrew. Andrew says, I'm using an HTML image map for each area that is clicked by a blue rectangle. It can be orange depending on the device. It's displayed briefly, even if the shape happens to be a circle. Can this be turned off? And he's tried a few WebKit tricks in his CSS, but didn't have much luck. Now, Andrew, I actually had a look at this, and it seems like the implementation that we have in WebView unfortunately has this side effect. There is nothing we can do at the moment. Unfortunately, we can pass it on to the engineering team. One thing I can tell you, however, which it doesn't really help you, I think. If this is an app, it doesn't help you. But if it's just a website, it's an app. Okay. If it was a website, what I did is I tried it in Chrome on Android, and it didn't result in those blue squares.
Yeah, it's fine in Chrome. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is it's a difference in behavior on the WebView component on Android. I even confirmed it actually in the browser itself, not just the WebView component. So yeah, we'll take that back and report it to the team. But is it a major showstopper for you?
Oh, it's not. It's just something that the client that I'm working with has noticed that every time that they use the image map and they're clicking around on the page, they see these little blue squares appearing, and it's just a little bit annoying compared to when you use these sites on the desktop or on an iPad. You don't see these kind of highlighted areas as you're clicking around on the site. So it was just something I was trying to work out if there was a bit of CSS that I could stick in there, or whether there was an attribute in the XML I could put around the web view that would turn that kind of stuff off. But yeah, I've tried several things and none of them seem to work. So
yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, we'll take it back to the team.
Cool.
And let you know. All right, next question. Why is there no satellite mode for map view? The method setSatellite actually sets hybrid mode, including both tiles of aerial imagery with roads and names superimposed. So right now there is no way to show only aerial imagery without roads. Anirudh?
Yeah, this is true, and we have an open issue on our Android issue tracker regarding this. It's something we'll look at. Thanks for your feedback.
Yeah. All right. Again, thanks for reporting it. Sorry we don't actually have a workaround for you. The only workaround which I probably wouldn't recommend where it comes to using the map side of it is, using the web version of the map. And the only reason I say I wouldn't recommend it is just because I find that using that JavaScript version of maps in a web view, it doesn't perform as well as the native map view, map activity. Yeah. Next, why are we not able to attach image in the male body? Now, this person, this doesn't sound like a developer question actually. So, don't know the answer. Here's another one that doesn't sound like a developer question. Why does Android not have an official Google Sites app? I would love to customize my websites on the go. I suspect you could probably just go to the Google Sites page in your Android web browser and modify it there. I don't know that there would be a massive market for people modifying their Google Sites through a mobile app anyway. That's not necessarily the official reason, but that's just my thoughts. So not a developer question. We'll move on. Last time you mentioned that there are some new notification support in the support library. Can you tell us what notification features have been added there? Can Android 4.1 like notifications work in earlier versions? Anirudh?
Yes, we've added rich notification support, and there are some release notes with the support library which you can look at the new features added, but we do provide now rich notification support like the Jelly Bean ICS version.
Yeah, all the big content, expanded layout and priority, those things are now supported in the Compat, notification Compat library.
Cool. All right, well, there are no more questions on the moderator. Are there any other questions from people that are on the Hangout? Nope, doesn't look like it. Well, in that case, well, thank you for joining us for our first episode of Android Developer Lab Plus. We'll be back again next week. As you noticed today, we did a presentation on the AndroidManifest file. We'll be doing more of these sorts of topics of the week. So we've got a few ideas in mind, but if there are some specific topics that you guys would like us to talk about, please let us know. We're always interested in your feedback, and we do take it seriously. So on that note, thanks for joining in, and see you next time.
See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.